The notification sound echoed through my empty kitchen like a gunshot. Another 1,000 followers. Another 1,000 strangers who thought they knew my story. I stared at my phone screen, watching the numbers climb higher and higher, each digit a reminder of how far I'd fallen from the woman I used to be. 3 million views on a video I never meant to make public. My hands trembled as I set the phone down on the worn Formica counter where I'd rolled out Christmas cookies for 47 years. The same counter where I'd packed school lunches with love notes tucked inside, where I'd cried over divorce papers that never came because Harold and I were too stubborn to quit, where I'd celebrated grandchildren's first steps with champagne and tears of joy. Now it held the weight of my unraveling. The comments kept coming. Strangers calling me brave. Strangers calling me pathetic. Strangers dissecting every word, every gesture, every tear that had spilled from my eyes in that moment of complete breakdown. They analyzed my kitchen cabinets, my choice of sweater, the way my voice cracked when I spoke about loneliness. How did I get here? The house felt different now. Smaller. Like the walls were closing in with each notification, each share, each person who thought my pain was entertainment. I'd spent 67 years building a life, a reputation, a family that stretched across 3 states and 17 grandchildren. And somehow, in the span of one viral video that lasted 14 minutes and 37 seconds, it had all changed. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden where my late husband had planted roses every spring for 28 years. Pink Eden climbers, white iceberg bushes, and the deep red Mr. Lincoln roses that smelled like heaven after a summer rain. The thorns had grown wild now, just like everything else in my life since Harold's funeral 3 years ago. If they only knew the real story. If they knew about the morning I'd found Harold collapsed in the shower, how I'd performed CPR on the bathroom floor while waiting for paramedics who came too late. If they knew about the nights I'd sat in his recliner, wearing his cologne-scented sweaters, talking to his ghost until sunrise. If they knew that becoming viral wasn't about fame or attention, but about the desperate need to prove I still existed after feeling like I'd died with him. The phone buzzed again. Another comment. Another stranger who thought they understood my life based on 14 minutes of raw honesty. An attention-seeking old lady needs to log off and get a hobby. I closed my eyes and remembered what it felt like to be invisible. Maybe that was better than this. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. My name is Margaret Chin, and until 6 months ago I was invisible. Not in the way young people think they're invisible, full of drama and self-importance, believing the world revolves around their problems. I was invisible in the way that women my age become invisible. The way grocery store clerks look through you while helping the person behind you first. The way restaurant hostesses seat you by the kitchen assuming you won't complain. The way your own adult children check their phones while you're speaking, nodding absently as if your words are background noise. I'm 67 years old, and I can tell you the exact moment I realized I'd disappeared from the world. It was a Tuesday morning in March, unseasonably cold for Oregon, and I was standing in line at Walgreens waiting to pick up my blood pressure medication. The pharmacist, a girl young enough to be my granddaughter with perfectly straight teeth and confidence that comes from never doubting your own relevance, kept looking past me over my head as if I were a ghost haunting the prescription counter. When she finally acknowledged my presence, she spoke slowly, loudly, enunciating each syllable as if my gray hair had made me deaf and simple. Do you have your insurance card? I looked down at my hands gripping the counter. Real hands with liver spots that had appeared seemingly overnight and wedding ring indentations that remained even 3 years after burying my husband. These hands had changed 10,000 diapers, had kneaded bread for Sunday dinners that fed extended family and neighbors, and had held my mother's hand as she died of cancer at 74. These hands had built a life, had loved fiercely, had mattered. When did I become so small? I remember driving home that day in my 12-year-old Honda Civic, past the elementary school where I'd volunteered for 30 years before budget cuts eliminated the reading program I'd started. Past the church where I'd organized countless bake sales, where I'd sung in the choir until my voice grew thin with age. Past the house where I'd raised 3 children who now lived in different states and called on holidays when they remembered. My house sits on Maple Street, the same street where I'd walked as a young bride in 1976, when the neighborhood was filled with families like ours, middle class, stable, rooted. The neighborhood had changed completely. Young families had moved in, tech workers from Portland who could afford the commute, with their perfect lawns maintained by landscaping services and their Tesla cars that hummed silently past my kitchen window. I'd become the old lady next door, the one they smiled at politely but never really saw. The one whose newspaper sometimes sat on the driveway for days because I forgot to bring it in, whose garden was slowly going wild because Harold had been the one who understood pruning schedules and fertilizer timing. I had 17 grandchildren spread across the country like scattered seeds. 17 beautiful souls with their own lives, their own friends, their own problems. I knew them through FaceTime calls that lasted 5 minutes before they got distracted, through birthday cards with crisp $20 bills tucked inside, through Christmas visits that felt more like obligations than celebrations. I knew their favorite colors, their fears, their dreams that changed as quickly as their clothing sizes. But somehow in the process of loving them all, I'd forgotten my own dreams. I'd forgotten that I used to have dreams. The roses in my garden had been blooming that March morning, the same roses Harold had planted for our silver anniversary. Pink and white petals scattered across the walkway like confetti from a party I'd missed, a celebration of spring that I was too numb to notice. How long have I been sleepwalking through my own life? That night I'd sat in Harold's recliner, the one I couldn't bring myself to move or donate, and tried to remember the last time I'd felt fully awake. The last time I'd felt like Margaret Chin instead of just Mom or Grandma or the widow from Maple Street. I couldn't remember. The story really begins with my daughter Linda, but to understand Linda, you need to understand how we got here. Linda is my middle child, 42 years old, and she's always been the one who worried about everyone else. As a little girl, she was the one who reminded her brothers to wear jackets, who brought home stray cats and injured birds, who cried when she saw homeless people on television. That compassion never left her, but it grew heavier with age, more burdened with responsibility. After Harold died, Linda appointed herself as my guardian angel, whether I wanted one or not. She started calling every day, sometimes twice a day, her voice tight with the particular anxiety that comes from loving someone you can't fix. "Mom, did you remember to take your blood pressure medication?" she'd ask as if I'd suddenly become incompetent at 64. "Did you eat something besides toast for breakfast? Are you getting enough protein?" The calls weren't really about my health. They were about her fear. The fear that she'd lose me too, that she'd get a call like the one she'd gotten about Harold. The fear that I was slipping away from the family, disappearing into grief and solitude. "Mom, you need to get out more," she'd say, her voice carrying that particular tone adult children use when they're managing their aging parents like a project that needs completion. "Maybe you should try that senior center downtown. They have activities. Bridge tournaments, craft classes, exercise programs designed for people your age." Activities. As if I were a child who needed to be entertained, a problem to be solved with organized fun. But Linda meant well. She always meant well, which somehow made it worse. She'd drive up from Portland once a month, bringing groceries I didn't need and reorganizing my medicine cabinet with the efficiency of someone who'd watched too many home organization shows. She'd sit at my kitchen table, scrolling through her phone while we talked, occasionally looking up to ask if I needed anything. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter was worried I was isolated while she isolated herself behind a screen during our visits. "I'm fine," I'd tell her, because that's what you say. That's what mothers have always said, even when they're drowning in plain sight. Even when fine means eating dinner alone 7 nights a week, talking to the television, falling asleep in chairs because the bed feels too empty. My son Michael calls from Denver every Sunday at exactly 2 p.m. Mountain Time, as reliable as a Swiss watch and about as emotionally available. He's a good son, responsible, successful, the kind of man Harold would have been proud of. He manages a team of software developers for a company whose name I can never remember, something that sounds like a sneeze followed by corporate buzzwords. During our calls, he tells me about his work projects: Sarah's promotion to senior marketing director, little Tommy's soccer season, Emma's dance recitals. His life is a carefully curated highlight reel of suburban success, and I'm the weekly audience, the grandma who makes appropriate sounds of approval and asks the right questions. "And how are you, Mom?" he always asks at the end, but I can hear him rustling papers, can picture him checking his email while I speak. His attention is divided, parceled out among a dozen competing priorities. "I'm fine," I tell him too, because that's easier than explaining that I sometimes go 3 days without speaking to another human being. Easier than admitting that I've started talking to Harold's photo on the mantle, asking his opinion about what to make for dinner. My youngest, David, is the artist in the family, the one who followed his heart instead of a business plan. He lives in Brooklyn with his husband James, and they run a small gallery together in a neighborhood that gentrified around them like rising water. David calls at random times, usually when he's walking somewhere and I can hear the city noise in the background. Sirens, car horns, the beautiful chaos of 8 million people living on top of each other. He's the one who still asks about my dreams, who remembers that I used to paint watercolors before life got in the way. Before children and mortgages and the daily business of survival pushed creativity into a box in the hall closet. You should start painting again, Mom, he told me last Christmas when he was home for 3 days. The maximum amount of time he could handle in small-town Oregon before the quiet drove him back to the city. You were really good. I still have that painting you did of the lighthouse in Cannon Beach. I'd smiled and nodded, but the truth was, I couldn't remember the last time I'd wanted to create something beautiful. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt beautiful enough myself to believe I had beauty to offer the world. The turning point came in April, 6 weeks after the pharmacy incident that had shown me my own invisibility. I was having lunch with my neighbor Eleanor, who's 73 and still drives her ancient Buick to the grocery store twice a week, honking at drivers half her age who don't signal their turns. Eleanor is what people politely call feisty, which means she says what she thinks and doesn't apologize for taking up space in the world. We were sitting in her sunroom, eating tuna sandwiches on white bread and watching the birds at her feeder. Eleanor keeps detailed records of which birds visit when, like a meteorologist of the backyard ecosystem. You know what I've been thinking about? Eleanor said, brushing crumbs from her lap with hands that shook slightly with age but moved with purpose. That time you stood up to Principal Morrison at Tommy's school. Remember that? I did remember. Tommy was Linda's oldest, and he'd been suspended for defending a smaller boy who was being bullied by a group of 6th graders. The principal, a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, had been condescending and dismissive, treating the whole situation like boys being boys, like cruelty was just part of growing up. I marched right into that office, I said, surprising myself with the clarity of the memory, with how good it felt to remember a time when I'd had fire in my voice. I told him that if he couldn't protect the children in his care, maybe he wasn't qualified to be in charge of them. Eleanor laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. You were magnificent. You had fire in your eyes. I'd never seen anything like it. That man was twice your size and you made him look like a scolded child. Fire in my eyes. When had I lost that fire? When had I started apologizing for existing instead of demanding to be heard? You know what else I remember? Eleanor continued, her voice growing softer, more thoughtful. When you organized that whole campaign to save the old library. You got 500 signatures, showed up at every city council meeting for 6 months. You wouldn't take no for an answer. I'd forgotten about that too. This was back in the 80s when the city wanted to tear down the Carnegie Library and build a parking lot for the new shopping center. I'd rallied the whole neighborhood, made flyers on Harold's typewriter, organized letter-writing campaigns, stood up at town meetings with my knees shaking but my voice steady. We'd won. The library was still there, now on the historical register, its stone facade bearing a small plaque that mentioned the grassroots campaign that saved it. I'd walked past that plaque 1,000 times without remembering that I'd been part of creating it. I used to be different, I said quietly, the words tasting strange in my mouth. You're still different, Eleanor said, reaching across the space between our chairs to pat my hand. You're just hiding. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Eleanor's words, about the woman I used to be. I got up and walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in years. The walls were covered with family photos. Weddings, graduations, Christmas mornings, vacation snapshots. But there were older photos too, ones I'd forgotten about. There was Harold and I on our honeymoon in San Francisco, both of us so young and full of plans we thought we could control. There was a picture of me at a PTA meeting, gesturing with my hands, making a point about something I couldn't remember but clearly felt passionate about. In the hallway closet, behind winter coats that smelled of mothballs and memories, I found boxes of my old journals. I'd kept them faithfully for 20 years, then stopped sometime in the mid-90s when life became too busy for reflection, too complicated for the luxury of self-examination. I pulled one out at random and opened it to a page dated September 15, 1989. Had the most wonderful conversation with Mrs. Peterson today about the new recycling program. She's 87 and sharper than most people half her age. She reminded me that age is just a number, and that we have wisdom to share if people would only listen. Sometimes I feel like I'm just getting started, like the best parts of my life are still ahead of me. Harold laughed when I told him this, but not in a mean way. He said I've always been an optimist even when optimism seems foolish. I closed the journal and sat on the closet floor, surrounded by boxes of my former self, evidence of a woman who had dreams and opinions and fire in her eyes. What happened to that woman? The first time I tried to make a video, I deleted it immediately. It was early May and I'd been thinking about Eleanor's words for weeks, carrying them around like a stone in my pocket that I couldn't stop touching. I'd also been watching YouTube videos, something I'd never done before, something that would have seemed as foreign to me as speaking Mandarin. Linda had shown me how to use the iPad she'd given me for Christmas, thinking I'd use it to video chat with the grandchildren who lived too far away for regular visits. Instead, I found myself falling down rabbit holes of content I never knew existed. Cooking videos by chefs who made everything look effortless. Gardening tutorials by people who spoke about soil composition with the passion of poets. Women talking about their lives with a camera like they were confiding in their best friend. There was something mesmerizing about it, this window into other people's worlds. The intimacy of it, the way strangers shared their knowledge and their pain and their joy with anyone who cared to listen. I started watching videos made by other older women. There weren't many, but the ones I found were fascinating. A 70-year-old woman in Texas who reviewed makeup with the expertise of someone who'd been applying mascara longer than her viewers had been alive. A grandmother in Minnesota who taught people how to quilt, her gnarled fingers moving across fabric with muscle memory built over decades. A retired teacher in Florida who read poetry in a voice weathered by years of projecting over classroom noise, each word carved with the precision of someone who understood the weight of language. They all seemed so confident, so comfortable in their own skin. They spoke directly to the camera like they were talking to a friend, like they had something valuable to offer and weren't afraid to offer it. Could I do that? The thought was ridiculous. I was nobody special. I was just a widow from a small town in Oregon who'd raised 3 children and buried her husband and was slowly disappearing into the wallpaper of old age. What did I have to say that anyone would want to hear? But the thought wouldn't go away. It followed me through my daily routines, whispered to me while I watered plants and sorted mail and ate dinner alone at a table set for one. I started small, talking to myself in the mirror, practicing conversations I might have with the camera. It felt foolish, standing in my bathroom at 67 years old, gesturing at my own reflection like a woman who'd lost her mind. But it also felt liberating. Like I was remembering how to use my voice for something other than small talk and grocery store politeness. The first video I actually recorded was about gardening. I set up the iPad in my kitchen, propping it against a stack of cookbooks, and talked about how to start seedlings indoors. I rambled for 15 minutes about soil pH and watering schedules, gesturing with my hands the way I used to do when I was passionate about something, when I believed my opinion mattered. When I played it back, I was horrified. My voice sounded older than I expected, creaky and uncertain. My hands looked weathered, spotted with age. My gray hair was messy, my sweater was shapeless, and I looked exactly like what I was, an old woman talking to herself in an empty kitchen. I deleted it immediately and didn't try again for 2 weeks. The second video was about cooking. I was making Harold's favorite pot roast, the recipe I'd perfected over 30 years of marriage through trial and error and his patient taste testing. As I worked, browning the meat and chopping vegetables, I found myself talking about memories, how Harold would hover in the kitchen trying to sneak tastes, how the smell of rosemary and thyme would fill the whole house and draw the children in from wherever they'd scattered. The secret, I told the camera, feeling more natural than I had in years, is to brown the meat first. Most people skip this step because they're in a hurry, but it makes all the difference. Harold used to say my pot roast was better than his mother's, and let me tell you, that woman guarded her recipes like state secrets. She never forgave me for stealing her son, but she had to admit I could cook. I was more relaxed in this video, more natural. I caught myself smiling while I talked, remembering not just the recipe but the joy of feeding people I loved. I watched it back 3 times before I got the courage to post it. 3 views. All probably mine. But something had shifted. I'd put a piece of myself out into the world, and the world hadn't ended. Nobody had laughed at me or told me to stop. Nobody had even noticed, but that was okay. The act of being seen even by no one had reminded me that I existed. I made another video the next week. Then another. They were simple, homemade, nothing fancy. Me talking about whatever was on my mind. Recipes I'd learned from my mother, gardening tips Harold had taught me, memories of my children when they were young and thought I knew everything. Slowly people started watching. First 10 views, then 50, then 100. The comments were mostly kind, sometimes just a heart emoji or a simple thank you. People thanked me for sharing my recipes. They asked questions about my garden. They told me I reminded them of their own grandmothers. "You have such a warm voice," one comment said. "Like a hug through the screen." Another said, "My grandmother used to make pot roast just like this. Watching you cook brought back such beautiful memories." I started to look forward to making videos. It gave me something to do, something to plan for, something that made me feel connected to the world beyond my empty house. I'd think about what I wanted to share, set up the camera, and for 20 or 30 minutes I'd feel like myself again. Like Margaret Chin, not just the widow from Maple Street. Linda noticed first during one of her monthly visits in July. "You seem different, Mom," she said, watching me move around the kitchen with more energy than I'd had in months. "Happier. More animated. Are you dating someone?" The question was so absurd that I laughed out loud, a sound that surprised us both. "Dating? At my age? Don't be ridiculous." "Well, something's changed. You're more like your old self. The way you used to be before." Before Harold died, she meant. Before I became a project to be managed instead of a person to be enjoyed. I hadn't told my children about the videos. I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding pathetic. "Hi kids, your mother is talking to strangers on the internet because she's lonely and forgotten how to matter." But Linda was right. I did feel different. More awake. More present. Like I'd been holding my breath for 3 years and finally remembered how to exhale. The trouble started in late July, on a day so hot that the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. I'd been making videos for 3 months and my subscriber count had grown to about 500 people. It felt like a small miracle having 500 people who chose to spend time with me each week, who looked forward to my simple stories and homemade wisdom. That's when I made the video about loneliness. I hadn't planned it. I'd set up the camera to talk about summer tomatoes, about how to tell when they're perfectly ripe, about the satisfaction of growing something beautiful and nourishing. But I'd had a particularly difficult day, one of those days when the silence in my house felt loud enough to drown in. Michael had canceled our Sunday call because of a work emergency that couldn't wait. David had texted instead of calling, a quick message that said he was busy with gallery preparations. Linda had sent an article about senior communities with a note that said, "Just thinking ahead. It might be good to have options." Options. As if my life had become a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed. I sat in front of the camera, surrounded by ripe tomatoes that smelled like summer and childhood and Harold's vegetable garden, and instead of talking about produce, I talked about what it felt like to be invisible. I stood in the grocery store today for 20 minutes, waiting for someone to help me reach something on a high shelf. Person after person walked by and I might as well have been furniture. I wanted to shout, "I'm here. I matter. I have stories to tell and love to give." But instead I smiled and said nothing, because that's what we do. We disappear gracefully. I talked about the silence in my house, about how I'd started leaving the TV on just to hear human voices. About eating dinner alone every night at a table that used to seat 8, surrounded by empty chairs that held the ghosts of family dinners. People think that when you get older you need less. Less space, less attention, less dreams. But the truth is we need more. We need to know that our lives mattered, that we mattered. We need to know that we're not just waiting to die. I cried during that video. Not dramatic tears, not the kind of crying that calls attention to itself. Just the quiet kind that slips down your cheeks when you're tired of pretending everything is fine, when the weight of invisible suffering becomes too heavy to carry alone. I talked about Harold, about how people stopped mentioning him after the first year, as if grief had an expiration date. About how I'd become the widow instead of Margaret, defined by loss instead of the 64 years of life that came before it. "I'm not just someone's mother or grandmother or widow," I said to the camera, my voice growing stronger even as tears fell. "I'm a person with thoughts and feelings and experiences that matter. I've loved and lost and learned and grown, and that should count for something." I almost didn't post it. I sat with my finger hovering over the upload button for an hour, Afraid that I'd revealed too much, shared too much pain. Afraid that people would see weakness instead of strength, self-pity instead of honest reflection. But something made me hit that button. Maybe it was the hope that somewhere someone else was feeling the same way. Maybe it was the need to stop pretending, to stop performing happiness I didn't feel. Within hours, the video had 1,000 views. Then 5,000. Then 50,000. The comments poured in like a flood. Hundreds of them, then thousands. People sharing their own stories of loneliness, of feeling invisible, of missing the person they used to be. Thank you for saying what we're all thinking. I'm 74 and I feel this so deeply. You put words to feelings I couldn't express. You're not alone. None of us are alone. I've been a widow for 5 years and this is exactly how I feel. My mother could have made this video. I'm calling her right now. For the first time in years I felt heard. Truly heard. Not managed or worried about or patted on the head but heard. But then Linda called. Mom, what is this? Her voice was tight with panic, the kind of controlled hysteria that comes from discovering your parents has gone off script. Eleanor's daughter just called me. She said you're on YouTube talking about being lonely. She's worried about you. She thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. My heart sank. I'd been so focused on the strangers who were listening that I'd forgotten about the people who actually knew me, who would see vulnerability as evidence of instability. It's nothing, I said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. Just something I do to pass the time. Mom, there are thousands of comments on this video. Thousands. People are sharing it everywhere. Did you know that? Did you know that people are talking about you online? I hadn't known. I'd been so overwhelmed by the response that I'd barely looked at the analytics, the numbers that seemed too large to be real. I'm coming up this weekend, Linda said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd already made decisions for both of us. We need to talk about this. We need to figure out what's going on. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my phone, watching the numbers climb. The video had reached 100,000 views. The comments were still pouring in faster than I could read them. Some were beautiful. Stories of hope, of connection, of people who felt less alone because of what I'd shared. Testimonies of grief and resilience, of finding purpose after loss. Others were cruel. People make fun of my appearance, my age, my tears. Comments that cut deep, that made me question everything I thought I'd accomplished. Attention-seeking old lady. Get a hobby instead of crying on the internet. This is embarrassing. Someone should take her computer away. Crying grandma needs a therapist, not YouTube. I closed the laptop and sat in my dark kitchen, surrounded by the familiar ghosts of my former life, wondering what I'd done. Had I made a terrible mistake? The phone rang at 6 a.m. It was David calling from New York, where it was already 9 a.m. and the gallery was probably bustling with morning light and possibility. Mom, what's happening? James just showed me your video. It's everywhere. People are sharing it on Facebook, on Twitter. Someone made a TikTok reaction video. You're famous. Famous. The word felt foreign, like something that happened to other people, not to 67-year-old widows from small towns. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said. But Mom, it's beautiful. What you said, how honest you were. People need to hear this. You gave words to something so many people feel. But Linda's upset. She thinks I'm having a breakdown. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, maybe you're having a breakthrough instead. Linda arrived on Saturday morning with a folder full of printouts and a look of barely contained panic that reminded me of the day she discovered I'd let 8-year-old Michael walk to school by himself. Mom, we need to talk, she said, settling at my kitchen table like she was conducting an intervention, like she was the parent and I was the troubled child who needed correction. She spread the papers across the table with the efficiency of a lawyer presenting evidence. Screenshots of comments, articles about online predators, statistics about identity theft, printed warnings about the dangers of social media for seniors. Do you realize that strangers know where you live? That they can see inside your house? That some of these people commenting on your videos have been following you online, looking up your address, your family members? I stared at the papers, feeling smaller with each word she spoke, feeling the confidence I'd built over 3 months of small victories crumble like old newspapers. I was just trying to connect with people, I said quietly, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. Mom, you don't understand how dangerous this is. There are people who prey on vulnerable seniors. They pretend to be friends and then they ask for money or personal information. They use your loneliness against you. They see weakness and they exploit it. Vulnerable seniors. The words hit me like a physical blow, like a slap that left my cheek stinging with shame. Is that what I was? A vulnerable senior who'd been foolish enough to think that strangers might actually care about her? An old woman so desperate for attention that she'd made herself a target? I think you should delete everything, Linda continued, her voice gaining momentum like a train heading downhill. All of it. Every video, every comment, everything. And maybe we should look into some real activities for you. The senior center has bridge tournaments, craft classes, book clubs. Things with people your own age, people you can actually meet and trust. No, I said. The word surprised us both. I'd been agreeing with Linda about everything for so long that neither of us expected resistance. I'd become so accustomed to being managed that the sound of my own defiance felt foreign. Mom, please. I'm just trying to protect you. From what? From being heard? From mattering to someone? From having a voice in the world? From being taken advantage of? From making a fool of yourself online? From becoming a laughingstock? The air in the kitchen grew thick and heavy, charged with 3 years of accumulated worry and frustration. Linda's face was flushed, her hands shaking slightly with the particular tremor that comes from fear disguised as anger. I could see the terror in her eyes, the same fear I'd seen when she was 12 and I'd come home late from a PTA meeting, when she thought something terrible had happened to me. Is that what you think I'm doing? I asked, my voice growing steadier with each word. Making a fool of myself? Mom, that video, the one about being lonely, it's been shared 60,000 times. People are talking about you on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok. They're making memes about you. They're calling you the crying grandma. Is that really what you want? Crying grandma. I felt something break inside me, something that had been cracked for years finally shattering completely. All those beautiful comments, all those people who'd said they felt less alone, all those connections I'd made, reduced to a cruel nickname, turned into entertainment for people who saw my pain as content to be consumed and discarded. I want to matter, I whispered, the words coming from a place so deep I hadn't known it existed. I want to know that my life meant something. I want to know that I existed for more than just raising children and making pot roast and disappearing quietly when it's convenient for everyone else. Linda's expression softened, but only slightly. Mom, you do matter. You matter to us. To your grandchildren. To the people who actually know you. But you don't see me, I said, my voice growing stronger, fed by years of swallowed words and suppressed needs. None of you see me. You see an old woman who needs to be managed, who needs to be protected from herself. You see someone who's already half gone, someone whose only job is to exist quietly until she doesn't exist at all. That's not true. When was the last time you asked me what I wanted? Not what I needed, not what would be safe, not what would be appropriate for someone my age, but what I wanted. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams, my fears, my hopes for the future? Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. We both knew the answer. I've been invisible for so long that I forgot I existed, I continued, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. Those videos, those comments, those people, they reminded me that I'm still here. That I still have things to say, stories to tell, wisdom to share. That I'm more than just your mother or their grandmother or Harold's widow. But Mom, the comments. Some of them are so cruel. People are making fun of you. They're turning you into a joke, a meme. They're laughing at your pain. She pulled out her phone and showed me a screenshot. Someone had taken a frame from my video, the moment when I'd wiped away a tear, and added text. When you realize you're trending on YouTube at 67. Below it, dozens of laughing emoji faces, comments that turned my grief into punchlines. The humiliation was crushing, like being stripped naked in front of a crowd of strangers. I'd shared my deepest pain, my most vulnerable moment, and people were laughing at it, turning it into entertainment. I'm sorry, Linda said softly, seeing the devastation on my face. I know this hurts, but this is why I'm worried. The internet can be a cruel place, especially for people who aren't used to it. I stared at the image on her phone, my own face frozen in a moment of authentic grief, reduced to a punchline for people who didn't know me. Is this what I wanted? But then I thought about the other comments. The woman who'd said she felt less alone. The man who'd called his estranged mother after watching my video. The teenager who'd written that I reminded her to call her grandmother. The widow who'd shared her own story of grief and gradual healing. Show me the rest, I said. What? Show me the other comments. The ones you didn't print out. The ones that aren't mean. Reluctantly, Linda pulled up the video on her phone. We scrolled through the comments together and I watched her face change as we read. Yes, there were cruel ones. But there were so many more that were kind, that were grateful, that were real. This made me cry in the best way. Thank you for being so honest about something so many of us feel. I'm going to call my mom right now. I haven't talked to her in weeks and this reminded me how precious time is. You're not invisible to us. We see you. We hear you. Thank you for sharing your heart. I lost my husband last year and I've been feeling so alone. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not the only one struggling with this. My grandmother died before I was old enough to really know her. Listening to you feels like getting to have conversations I never got to have. I'm 34 and I feel invisible too. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone in this feeling. As we read, I watched Linda's face change. The fear was still there, the protective worry that had defined our relationship since Harold's death. But something else was creeping in. Understanding maybe. Or recognition. There are thousands of them, she said quietly, her voice losing some of its earlier certainty. Thousands of people who connected with what you said. I know. But Mom, the mean ones, they're so mean. How do you handle that? How do you read something so cruel about yourself and keep going? I thought about it for a moment, remembering lessons learned over 67 years of living, of facing criticism and cruelty and the general hardness of the world. The same way I handled mean comments when I was raising you kids, I said. The same way I handled criticism when I was fighting for the library, when I was standing up to that principal, when I was doing anything that mattered. I remember that the people who matter are the ones who see me, really see me. The cruel comments come from people who don't know me, who don't want to know me. They're reflecting their own pain, their own fear of becoming invisible themselves. Linda was quiet for a long time, scrolling through more comments, reading stories of loneliness and connection, of grief and hope. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Smaller, more uncertain. I'm scared, she said. Of what? Of losing you. Of something bad happening to you. Of not being able to protect you the way I should. I reached across the table and took her hands. They were trembling, and I realized that my capable, successful daughter was still the little girl who'd worried about stray cats and homeless people, who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Honey, you can't protect me from living, I said gently. You can't protect me from being hurt or from making mistakes or from being vulnerable. That's not protection, that's a prison. But what if something happens? What if someone tries to scam you or hurt you, or what if something wonderful happens? I interrupted. What if I help someone feel less alone? What if I connect with people who need to hear what I have to say? What if I remember who I am? We sat there in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my new life. The printouts of comments, the laptop with its glowing screen, the phone that buzzed with notifications from people who wanted to hear what I had to say. I don't know how to do this, Linda said finally. I don't know how to let you be yourself. I don't know how to stop worrying. You don't have to let me, I said. I'm going to do it anyway. The question is whether you want to be part of it or not. That evening, after Linda left, not angry but confused, carrying uncertainty like a heavy bag, I sat down and made another video. I talked about the conversation with my daughter, about the cruel comments and the kind ones, about what it meant to be seen and heard and valued in a world that preferred older women to be quiet and grateful and invisible. I know some of you are laughing at me, I said to the camera, my voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. I know some of you think I'm pathetic or attention-seeking, or just a foolish old woman who doesn't know when to be quiet. And maybe you're right. Maybe I am all of those things. But I'm also alive. I'm also here. I'm also someone who has loved and lost and learned and grown, someone who has stories to tell and wisdom to share. And if that makes me a meme, if that makes me a joke, then so be it. At least I'm not invisible anymore. I talked about the price of being seen, about how vulnerability always comes with the risk of being hurt. About how the alternative, staying safe and silent and small, felt like a different kind of death. I'd rather be a laughingstock than a ghost, I said. I'd rather be criticized than ignored. I'd rather risk being hurt than guarantee being forgotten. The video went viral overnight. 2 million views in 24 hours. Featured on news websites, shared by celebrities, discussed on talk shows. The crying grandma had become something bigger than I'd ever imagined, a phenomenon that stretched far beyond my small kitchen and my simple desire to be heard. And I realized that the climb wasn't the scary part. The scary part was deciding what to do with the view from the top. The interview requests started coming in on Tuesday morning like autumn leaves in a windstorm. Sudden, overwhelming, covering everything. Local news stations wanted to do feel-good segments about the grandmother who'd captured hearts. National morning shows offering to fly me to New York for 5-minute appearances between weather reports and cooking demonstrations. Podcasts, magazines, radio shows, everyone wanting a piece of the viral grandma story. I said no to most of them. The producers and bookers didn't understand my refusal. They offered money, fame, opportunities that other people would kill for. They painted pictures of book deals and speaking tours, of being the face of senior empowerment. But I'd already learned the difference between being seen and being consumed. I said yes to one request. A small podcast run by a woman named Sarah Chin, no relation despite the shared surname, who'd lost her own grandmother the year before. She'd reached out not because I was viral, but because my story had reminded her of the conversations she'd wished she'd had with her grandmother before it was too late. "I want to talk to you as a person," she said when she called, her voice soft with genuine curiosity rather than the brittle enthusiasm of media professionals. Not as a meme or a trend or a viral moment. Just as Margaret. It was the first time in months that anyone had used my actual name instead of calling me the crying grandma, or YouTube's favorite grandmother, or any of the other labels that had been stuck to me like price tags. We talked for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon while rain drummed against my kitchen windows. About Harold, about my children, about the garden and the empty house and the feeling of disappearing. About what it meant to be seen again, even if it came with a price I hadn't expected to pay. "Do you regret it?" she asked near the end. "Making that first video? Opening yourself up to all of this?" I thought about it carefully, weighing the cruel comments against the kind ones, the invasion of privacy against the connections I'd made, the loss of anonymity against the recovery of my voice. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. I regret that it took me so long to remember that I had a voice worth using." The podcast came out a week later. It was different from the viral videos, gentler and more thoughtful. People listened to it and heard Margaret Chin, not just the crying grandma. They heard a full person with a complete story, not just a moment of pain frozen in internet amber. My children listened to it too. Michael called me after hearing it, and for the first time in years he didn't sound distracted. There was no rustling of papers, no divided attention, just his full presence on the other end of the line. "Mom, I had no idea you felt so invisible," he said, his voice thick with something that might have been guilt or grief or simply recognition. "I'm sorry. I should have paid more attention." "You were living your life," I told him. "That's what you were supposed to do. That's what I raised you to do. But I could have included you more. I could have seen you more clearly. I could have asked better questions." We talked for an hour that day. Really talked. About his work, yes, but also about his fears, his dreams, his memories of his father. About what it felt like to be middle-aged and watching his mother transform into someone he didn't recognize but was beginning to admire. "I like this version of you," he said before we hung up. "You seem more yourself. More like the mom I remember from when I was little, when you seemed like you could do anything." David was more direct when he called his artists seeing patterns that others missed. "Mom, you're famous," he said without preamble. "Like actually famous. Do you know that people are making reaction videos to your videos? That there are articles about you in major publications? That someone started a hashtag called #CMargaret. "I'm not famous," I said, though the evidence suggested otherwise. "I'm just visible." Same thing, isn't it? And maybe that's what the world needs. More visible grandmothers, more women who refuse to disappear just because they've gotten older. Maybe he was right. Maybe visibility and fame were the same thing when you'd been invisible for so long that any attention felt overwhelming. Linda took longer to come around. She was still worried about the negative comments, still concerned about my safety, still wanting to protect me from a world that could be cruel to vulnerable people. But she also started watching my videos more carefully, reading the comments with fresh eyes, seeing the good alongside the bad. "I showed your garden video to Sarah," she told me during one of our phone calls. "She wants to start a vegetable garden with the kids next spring. She said you made it look so peaceful, so manageable." "It is peaceful," I said. "That's the point. I never really thought about it that way. I always saw gardening as just another chore, another thing on the to-do list. We were learning to see each other differently. Linda was learning that her mother was more than just someone who needed protection. I was learning that my daughter's worry came from love, not control, from her own fear of loss rather than a desire to diminish me. The numbers kept growing in ways that felt surreal, divorced from the reality of my daily life. 3 million subscribers. 5 million. 10 million. The scale was incomprehensible to me, but the feeling remained the same. People were listening. I started making different kinds of videos, still personal and honest, but more intentional. I talked about aging with dignity, about loss and resilience, about the wisdom that comes with 7 decades of living. I shared recipes and gardening tips, but also memories and reflections, stories that connected past and present. I started getting invited to conferences about aging and social media, asked to speak at libraries and community centers about finding your voice later in life. Universities wanted to study the phenomenon of older adults on social media. Researchers reached out to understand how viral content could combat senior isolation. I was asked to write a book, to start a podcast, to license my story for a television movie that would star a famous actress playing a sanitized version of me. I said no to most of it. But I said yes to the things that felt real, that connected me to other people who felt invisible, who needed to know they weren't alone. I spoke at senior centers not about social media success, but about the importance of staying curious, of continuing to grow, of refusing to accept invisibility as the price of aging. Eleanor was proud of me in her quiet way. "You got your fire back," she said one afternoon as we sat in her sunroom, watching the birds that were preparing for their winter migration. "I never lost it," I said, understanding something about myself that had taken 67 years to recognize. "I just forgot where I put it." "Same thing," she said, echoing words that had become a theme in my new life. Maybe it was the same thing. Maybe losing something and forgetting where you put it required the same solution. You had to look for it with intention, with hope that it could be found again. The house doesn't feel empty anymore. Not because it's full of people, but because it's full of purpose. Every morning I wake up knowing that I have something to say, someone to connect with, some small way to matter in the world. I still eat dinner alone most nights, still sleep in a bed that's too big for one person, still miss Harold with an ache that will never completely fade. But loneliness has changed shape, becoming less sharp, less consuming. I'm not alone in my solitude anymore. Last week I got a letter from a woman named Rose who lives in a nursing home in Ohio. She's 81 years old and she'd been living there for 3 years, feeling forgotten by family who visited dutifully but briefly, feeling erased by a system that saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued. "I watched your first video," she wrote in handwriting that shook with age but moved with determination, "and I decided to start painting again. I haven't painted in 20 years, but your words reminded me that it's never too late to be creative, to make something beautiful, to remember who you are beyond what others expect you to be." She'd enclosed a small watercolor painting. It was simple, imperfect, beautiful in the way that honest effort always is. A field of wildflowers under a blue sky, painted by hands that remembered the joy of creation. On the back she'd written, "Thank you for reminding me that I'm still here." I put the painting on my refrigerator, next to pictures of my grandchildren and grocery lists and appointment cards. It fits perfectly, a reminder that visibility creates more visibility, that one voice can help others remember their own songs. That night I made a video about Rose's painting, about the letters I'd been receiving from people who felt seen by my willingness to be seen, about the community of invisible people who'd found each other through screens and stories. "We're all still here," I said to the camera, Rose's painting visible in the background like a small flag of resistance. "Every single one of us. We matter. Our stories matter. Our voices matter. Age doesn't erase us. It deepens us, adds layers of wisdom and experience that the world needs. And if the world can't see that, then maybe it's time to make some noise." The video got 2 million views in its first day, but more importantly, it got a comment from someone named Rose81 who wrote, "Still here. Still painting. Still grateful." That's when I knew I'd found my purpose again. Not to be famous, not to be viral, not to be a meme or a trend or a curiosity, but to be a reminder that none of us are truly invisible. We're all still here, waiting to be seen, hoping to be heard, deserving to be valued. And sometimes all it takes is one voice speaking honestly into the void to remind others that they have voices too.